Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us here today in another one of our dialogues within the leading complex times dialogues that IE has put in place. It's a pleasure to have two amazing people today here with us who are going to share their insights and their knowledge and expertise. So let me introduce you to Arthur Appleton. Arthur is JD, PhD. He's a visiting professor at IE, adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and he's a founding partner of Appleton Luff International Lawyers. Okay, and Altagracia Cuevas-Arthur. She's a program advisor at IE's School of Global and Public Affairs. Okay, so thank you both for being here today. As you all know, Arthur and Altagracia are going to talk about challenges to international trade and globalization these days, which is such an amazing topic. Lots of questions. They're going to have a conversation, and at the end of their conversation, we'll open the arena for questions. Okay, so you can make your questions and write your questions on the chat, and Altagracia will be managing the questions. Right, so thank you so much, Arthur. Altagracia, the arena is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for introducing us. It's indeed a pleasure, and thanks to IE Exponential Learning for making the invitation. I think this topic is very much in our minds nowadays. What are the challenges to international trade and globalization? And of course, this crisis is affecting us in many ways. So this session will be devoted to a discussion of the lasting effects of COVID-19. And it's, of course, its effects not only in globalization, but also in international trade, including global value chains, trading goods, services, developed in developing countries, etc. So we highly invite you all to interact, to send your comments and questions using the chat box at the end of the session, because we will enable questions and answer moment. So Arthur, as we all know, COVID-19 has claimed many victims all around the globe, direct and indirect victims. And according to the latest media reports, almost 2.5 million people have been reported to have coronavirus, out of which around 25% have recovered. But unfortunately, almost 171,000 mortal victims are still there on top of our heads. So in economic terms, can we say that globalization will be another victim of this pandemic? The floor is yours.
Hi, Altagracia, Maria. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me begin by saying that I don't think globalization is going to be a victim. We have a tendency to view history as linear, and it's not. We are in a period now of what I would call retrenchment for globalization. Globalization is here to stay. We're going to have scientific exchange. We're going to have travel. We're going to have tourism. We're going to have academic exchanges like we're doing today, but we're going to manage globalization differently. So we're going to have to reevaluate what works best, how we can avoid future problems, what should be the role of government, how would it be better to manage global supply chains. There are going to be many, many changes that we're going to see to globalization. There's going to be, we'll see some politicians move toward protectionism. We'll see others try to limit trade in certain goods that are necessary to manage a pandemic. Already we've seen certain countries try to limit the export of protective equipment, ventilators, masks. So yes, there are going to be limits to globalization, to the trade regime, particularly when important health issues are at stake. But globalization will not be the real victim, but it will be affected.
Okay, and also we know from the latest WTO estimates that COVID-19 is likely to cause world merchandise trade to plummet by between 13 and 32%, depending on whether we are talking about a more optimistic or pessimistic scenario. And the WTO has also mentioned that it will particularly affect sectors with complex value chains, such as electronics and automotive products. Trading services will also be affected considerably. And we also know about IMF estimates announcing that this pandemic will drag global GDP to drop lower by 3% into 2020. All these estimates, of course, just for this year, and sometimes taking an optimistic view because the pandemic is an ongoing process. So what do you think will be the long-lasting effects of COVID-19 in globalization in general and international trade in particular? Moreover, in the perspective of trading goods in global value chains and in trading services?
This is a long and complex question. First, there are going to be definitely some general implications. Those that manufacture and trade testing equipment, or those that are engaged in research and development in virology, are going to benefit. We're going to be reevaluating privacy rights, how we handle cell phone and video data, because these are being used as instruments to monitor and track the spread of the virus. We're going to see a reevaluation of how we handle straight research, laboratory research, food safety, food health. We're going to see a greater role for the World Health Organization, who has now come to the forefront in terms of trying to manage this pandemic. We're going to see a greater role for the regulators, not just safety of goods, but how we manage our services trade, how we manage health issues, how we manage food safety and laboratory safety. We're going to see a real change in how we manage our cities. The people most at risk from this pandemic are going to be the poor living in inner cities, those that don't have access to health. If you're living in a slum or a favela, it's going to be very, very difficult. But we can turn now to goods, services, and value chains. When it comes to goods, I think we're going to see a real difference in how we manufacture goods. Already we see organized labor in meat plants and Amazon facilities and other manufacturing and service providers starting to organize to better protect their workers. We're going to see a shift towards local production when it's possible as well. We minimize risk when goods travel less, and this goes hand in hand with those that are favoring local production in agriculture and other areas. We're going to see, as Saivin Evanet would probably point out if he were here, an increase in protectionism and a move for protectionist interest to capture part of the fear that exists. We're going to see problems with trade at the border, slower border crossings, more sanitary measures. When it comes to value chains, which is really tied to a lot of trade in goods, we're going to see that for goods that are critical, we're going to try to shorten the value chains. People are going to want to source components from closer to home. We know now from the WTO statistics that very complex electrotechnical value chains are at risk. So there'll be a move towards not just localizing production, but by a move towards bringing it closer to states that are manufacturing. I know living in Geneva, we had trouble with ventilator manufacturers. A part was coming from one of the EU countries that refused to export it. So ventilator production was temporarily stopped. And that, of course, has health effects that go well beyond Geneva. So we're going to see these kind of critical components probably come home to some extent. But we're also going to see a lot of mischief as well. We're going to see governments intervene based on so-called national security or health security. They'll try to commandeer certain portions of the production process. And this will have an effect on the economics of trade and will probably reduce efficiencies in some areas, but may result in the production of goods that are necessary. Moving to the last part of your question, services. That's probably where we're going to see some of the biggest changes. Look what we're doing right now. We are carrying on a lecture that normally I would do in Madrid, and we're doing it by the internet. All of my classes at Johns Hopkins, at IE, and other places are now on Zoom or WOW or different platforms. This is going to change the whole dynamics of education, but not just education. Air travel as well is going to be reduced. We're going to be sitting in our living rooms doing a lot more from home, and home-based work to the extent it's feasible is going to become more popular. Other sectors in the services will also be affected. Cruise ships, for instance, are vectors for promulgation of this. We've seen that. Airports, stadiums, all of these kind of services are going to be constrained in some manner. I wake up wondering sometimes if the yellow fever stamp in my yellow vaccination card is going to be replaced by a COVID-19 stamp to show I've been vaccinated or tested to get on an airplane or to go to a football game. Also, when it comes to services, we're going to see more security, but not just security in our ports and airports, but also over the internet. There's been so much misinformation passed around on cures for this virus and treatments for this virus. And I think there's going to be more of a push to police that as well. So to answer your question in a nutshell, we're going to see massive changes in the goods, services, and with global value chains.
If I may follow up on this question, Arthur, because we have many countries that are heavily reliant in tourism, and you were mentioning different forms of tourism. Do you expect some adjustments in the weight and importance in the years to come for this sector in these countries that heavily rely on tourism?
Until there is a vaccination or a very effective screening process, yes. Because when we talk about tourism, we also talk about going to restaurants, going to bars, going to sporting events, doing many things that involve breaking the 2-meter rule. So I do believe we're going to see an effect on tourism until we have adequate testing or vaccination. And that's going to put a lot of economic pressure on many countries, not just in Europe, but around the world.
Indeed. Let's get back to Asia. Because it's been in the headlines very lately. We know from recent media that many countries seem to blame China for allegedly not informing in a timely manner about COVID-19. The US has been particularly vocal in blaming China for the coronavirus origin and spread. And even today we read in the news that the United Kingdom and Germany have hardened their speech against China for allegedly hiding relevant data on the pandemic. Do you think COVID-19 will change, accelerate, or halt the world order pivot to Asia?
Okay. The pivot to Asia and the words world order, I don't like either of them. I don't think we have a world order, and judging from the situation right now, I think we have world disorder. And this pivot to Asia it's not new. It's a recognition of the fact that over 5 billion of the world's consumers are in Asia, and they've really developed a lot economically. People are using the expression pivot to Asia as a way of blaming China or putting the responsibility on China. It's almost like the politically correct way of saying, well, is this China's fault? The problem is a lot more complex than that. And we need to really think about it from a distance. We have politicians now that are exploiting the present situation. We have some politicians that are using this as a way to grow in popularity due to nationalism or racism, or to scare the voters or supporters in their favor. We have industry leaders that also have different agendas that are trying to profit economically from localized production or from changing the way goods are supplied. And they have a different agenda as well. Then we have the realpolitik camp that is very much interested in curbing China's expansion into Eastern Africa, into the South China Sea, and are using this as a way to put the brakes on China. And all of these are, I think, happening right now. And then we have another layer of society, which I would call them the democratic capitalists, that are trying to use this as a way of countering a more state-centric system of production. I think this so-called pivot to Asia and the future of it, believe it or not, is going to depend largely on what the United States and Europe do. The United States now has turned its back to a large extent on the rest of the world. They've given up their historical, political, philosophical, and economic role. They're no longer the icon they were a number of years ago, and they've really relinquished their soft power. And everybody knows that we abhor a vacuum, that somebody and someone or some country is going to move in to occupy that space. And that's what's happening. But it's not just China, it's other countries as well that see opportunities for promoting themselves. And I think this is really a response to the US and Europe, which is also having problems, which is also questioning its own European values. And we see this in a variety of European countries. Now, let's think about history for a minute. Until really the 1800s, China and India were among the richest countries of the world. They were really regimes of large populations, large trade, large production that were doing very, very well. The rise of the West is a fairly new and recent phenomenon. The rebalancing that's going on now is a recognition really of the 4.5 or 5 billion people that are in Asia that are a very, very dynamic and growing market. Why is it happening? Well, in part, it's because there are a lot of consumers, but also because education is flourishing in many parts of Asia, supply chains are working well, there's a lot of economic efficiency and competitiveness. Now, that is a reason for success. That is not necessarily a reason why we're pivoting towards Asia per se. It's a recognition of who has a comparative advantage. Now, on the other side, we see problems arising that are also going to restrain Asia's growth. We see poor working conditions, labor issues, lax environmental regulations, problems with IP enforcement, rule of law issues. And these are going to have a limiting effect on trade. But countries evolve, countries change over time. And I think we're going to see a gradual transition throughout Asia, just like Japan and Korea and other countries have transitioned. It would be a mistake to look at Asia as one regime. It's composed of many, many countries with many different political, economic, and social regimes, and with supply chains that are becoming increasingly interdependent. So yes, there may be a growth in Asia trade, but I think this is natural. It's recognition of the economic strength of Asia. And I think it would be wrong to pin the blame and responsibility for this just on Asia alone.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. If we may turn to the healthcare systems that have been put into so much stress lately, we all know that the ease with which COVID-19 spreads and its devastating consequences in vulnerable populations has not only collapsed many healthcare systems, hospitals, and facilities enabled for that, but also has caused a steep surge in demand of medical supplies such as masks, ventilators, personal protective equipment, hand sanitizer, pharmaceuticals, etc. And some countries have even put in place export restrictions on certain essential medical products, even in the presence of purchases from foreign governments, as is what the case recently with even Spain. And you were mentioning also one case of Switzerland. So many states have even adapted their industrial capacity to produce some of these goods. Here in Spain, we even have, for instance, HP producing ventilators, and many companies have adjusted, textile companies particularly, have adjusted also to produce some of this protective material. So in your opinion, will COVID-19 change the view, our view of healthcare and trade in health-related products? What's your opinion?
I think it will. Today, there was a joint statement released by the head of the WHO and the WTO together, talking about the importance of leaving the regime open, allowing for trade. But I think many countries, many WTO members are going to learn a lesson from COVID-19, and they're going to try to localize production or stockpile goods necessary for the next pandemic. We're seeing now that there's an overdependence on reagents from abroad, for masks, for personal protective equipment. And these goods need to be produced either through a secure supply chain or at home. And I think we're going to see that happen. We've had for many years the whole notion of food security being argued at the WTO. And I think to some extent, we're going to see health security becoming an issue as well. So either we're going to have trading partners that are more reliable, that we know that we can depend upon the supply, or we're going to need to be able to produce these goods at home. Now, this problem is going to be even more acute in countries that lack the production capacity or that have a large population that is relatively poor. And when we talk about urban dwellers in slums and favela or what have you, and countries that lack the production capacity to produce the goods they need, they're going to be even more dependent upon the trading system. And that poses a problem. We can't expect every country to produce these goods. So either it means stockpiling and storing these goods, or developing supply chains that are more based on planning and on reliable partners. From the lawyer's perspective, I would say that contracts will become more important as well, knowing that these goods will be delivered in the future. But there are other problems that the health system is going to have to face. COVID is a very unusual disease because it's attacking the elderly, it's attacking the poor, it's attacking the obese, the overweight. It's going to be more traumatic in countries that lack adequate health systems. So this is a disease that is going to require planning. And if there are going to be other viruses similar to this particular coronavirus, we're going to need to think about the future. So it is time for governments to sit down to talk about a plan for the future, where supply chains, value chains are intact, where goods are being produced and they are going to be delivered. But take a country, a rich country like the United States, take the European Union countries. Everywhere we've seen deficiencies in the hospital systems, in the supply chains, masks, ventilators, you name it. So it is time that we plan for the future, and there is going to be a need, I'm sorry, all you free marketers, for government to become more involved in healthcare planning.
Indeed, it is very compelling now in these times. Even Spain has had some problems in securing reliable supplies. So, and even had to return some tests because they were not reliable enough. So, of course, governments should start having conversations on that front from now onwards. If we move to the development side of this crisis, as some of us, as we all know, in recent years, developing countries in Asia, many portions of Africa have made major leaps forward in terms of developments. So do you expect COVID-19 will alter these development prospects or even the relationship between developed and developing countries? And if this is the case, how?
I've spoken a little bit about Asia already. Let's think about Africa, a continent where I've done a lot of work over the years. Africa is ripe for foreign direct investment in the healthcare sector, provided that certain governance issues are resolved. So I do expect African leaders to, one, put more of their own resources into healthcare, and two, to develop environments that are a little bit more open for foreign direct investment in healthcare sectors. The problem we're going to see in Africa and in many developing countries is that people are going to die from COVID-19 or become very, very sick, and we're not even going to know about it. They're not even going to show up on the statistics. And that's the first fear I have. Second, people in rural regions do not have good access to hospitals. This is true even in big countries like the United States. But this is going to be particularly acute in Africa and poorer regions in Latin America and Southeast Asia. So yes, I do think it's going to have an effect on development. It is going to have an effect on developing countries, but I think it's going to cause African leaders to reflect more on what they can do to improve their domestic healthcare systems. When we look to the GCC countries, we see countries that made improving healthcare a priority. When we look at what India and other countries have done attracting tourism for healthcare, we know that it can be done in countries around the world. But it is going to mean liberalizing policies on FDI and trade and services.
And regarding the relationship between developing countries and developed countries?
Well, I think that this is a relationship that is bound to grow closer and closer. When we look at the developing countries around the world, even when we look at East Africa, growth rates have been quite high. And we've seen renewed interest in the development of these countries. China, of course, has been a major investor in East Africa. United States is talking about a free trade agreement with Kenya, and Africa itself is coming together with its African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So there is a renewed interest in trade relations in Africa. There is a realization that Africa is mineral rich, that with good infrastructure and better education, it can be integrated more strongly into global value chains. And as a result, it would be foolish for the developed world, for the West, for the East to turn their back on Africa or other developing countries. This means starting to play an even more vital role in helping with infrastructure, helping with healthcare, investing. And I do believe there's lots of opportunity for the private sector and for the public sector to work with Africa. And what I mean is developing partnerships between developed countries and developing countries, and not just Africa. What I'm saying holds true for Latin America and Southeast Asia as well, and portions of Central Asia.
Mm-hmm. Great. And well, perhaps we can, in order not to take it to the end, many of the questions, because I'm now seeing the chat and there are already some questions there. One of them is coming from Simon Hernandez. He says he's a former student of yours. His question is, could total export bans of medical devices and personal protective equipment, such as that imposed by Colombia, in contrast to the export license regime implemented by the EU, be challenged with its success in WTO litigation and not justified under general exceptions? I believe it could be argued that total export bans are more trade restrictive than necessary for the protection of public health. It's a pretty specific question.
Whether it can be argued as a violation at the WTO or not is to some extent irrelevant, because by the time, assuming that the dispute settlement system were working properly, which it's not, by the time this dispute worked its way through the system, hopefully we'd have a vaccine and adequate testing to counter the virus. Yes, there's probably an Article 11 GATT violation. Yes, there is going to be a debate under Article 20, for instance, whether it's a measure necessary to protect human health. But it's a bit of an irrelevant debate because it's being done and many countries are doing it. And by the time the debate works its way through the system, we will have moved on. The better question is, what can we do to prevent future problems in this area, I fear.
Indeed. So perhaps related to that question as it relates to the WTO and WTO dispute settlement system and WTO covered agreements, perhaps we can ask you, about the role of the WTO and the WHO. You mentioned something before about a joint statement between the heads of these two organizations, but perhaps you can elaborate a bit more on how COVID-19 will affect the role of these organizations. Moreover, knowing that the WTO, for instance, even before the COVID crisis, there was an alleged crisis, including its dispute settlement mechanism, and also on the side of WHO, which has been heavily criticized, particularly by the US with Donald Trump's statements.
COVID-19 is a global problem, and it's going to take a global solution. This means that an organization like the WHO is not just relevant, but vital, because they're capable of organizing and bringing together the world's leaders to address this issue. For the United States to attack the WHO, I think it's very short-sighted. They should be encouraging the WHO to become more involved to help support the right measures, the right research and development, the right work in various countries to address this issue. The statement today by the Secretary General of both organizations, the joint statement, I think was very forward-looking because it recognizes the importance of international organizations dealing with an international problem. Viruses don't respect boundaries. And in a globalized world where we have tourists, businessmen, businesswomen, religious pilgrims, what have you, we're going to have viruses that spread. Whether they spread from people, whether they spread from the virus on goods, doesn't really matter. But in order to address this problem, it's beyond any one country in the world. Now, the responsibilities of the WHO and the WTO are very, very different. We need to realize that in order to address this problem, the organizations need to do what they're best at. And the WHO, I believe, will play an important role. And this pandemic, I think, will put its leadership on notice for future pandemics to get them more engaged. Cutting funding to the only international organization that can handle this kind of matter, I think, is extremely short-sighted. If anything, there should be more support. And we need to think more carefully of what the role of governments should be at the international level to address future pandemics.
Indeed.
We talk about WHO, we talk about WTO. There's also the Australia-based International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation that works with laboratories that may also have a role in this matter. So I think we need to realize that the international infrastructure does exist. It can be strengthened, it can be expanded. It should be supported.
Indeed. No, definitely. I'm taking a look back at the chat where we have now at this stage a very nice pile of questions. So one of them was partly answered by the way this discussion has unfolded. For instance, another student of yours, it seems like your fans are all here. So do you think the ongoing financial crisis would affect the present state of global trade? That was partly
answered by your WTO statistics.
Indeed. What kind of implications can we expect? I see that COVID-19 has hit us at a time of ongoing financial crisis. So can we expect the financial crisis to worsen? Can it be targeted in certain geographical areas? What are your forecasts?
I would say it can be targeted in certain sectors. If I own shares in airline, I think I'd be selling them tomorrow. Likewise, cruise ship lines, tourism, these are vulnerable sectors. Healthcare is a very, very positive sector. If I'm correct and we try to shorten global value chains, then bits and pieces, components coming from far away may find less of a market. So yes, well, let me go back to the beginning of the question. Yes, this is going to have a financial effect. Yes, this crisis is going to be serious. There was one prediction in Geneva that 40% of the small restaurants here may go bankrupt. And of course, that's a draw for tourism. People travel for different reasons. The tourism sector will be affected. But going well beyond that, I believe we're going to see a lot of other sectors affected as well. Banking, of course, financial services, insurance, reinsurance. But we can go all down the list of financial services. Companies to invest in, Zoom, WebEx, anywhere where you don't have to get on an airplane, just as we're doing right now. So yes, like any trade matter, there are going to be winners and losers. We need to pick them very, very carefully. The problem that we're seeing in the United States is a bit unusual. We're seeing sectors of society that are now out of work because their plants have closed, their factories have closed, they can no longer drive a taxi or do whatever they were doing before. And they're protesting because they can't feed their families. Yet, if they go back to work, the virus is going to spread and swaths of the population are going to die. So this is a very unusual situation in history where you have the cure or the treatment, which also causes dangerous effects on society and causes people to march in the street, egged on by the politicians. So it is problematic. But I do believe that the measures that are being put in place in the short term are the right measures. Isolation, distancing, refraining from travel when one can. Yes, they're going to have economic effects, and we realize that. Yes, we're going to lose a lot of jobs. The unemployment statistics in Switzerland, in the United States, and many European countries are very high as a result of this. Spain's a good example. But I think that this is part of the cure, and we need to be patient.
Indeed. There's another question I would like to draw from the audience. He says, which commodities, in your opinion, will benefit from the crisis, being it gold, water, agriculture, etc.? Thank you.
Alcoholic beverages.
Well,
they say that wine consumption is going up 1,000%, and in Switzerland we're going to have more alcoholics, more fat people because everybody's eating well at home, and more divorces. So this means the legal profession, alcohol, tobacco. No, to be serious, there are certain sectors, particularly healthcare, that are going to benefit, and not just in the short term, but in the long term. We're going to put a lot more resources into our healthcare sector, planning for the future. The private sector is not going to be happy with the idea that they need reserve capacity, that they must invest in ventilators, they must invest in masks or more hospital beds, but we're going to need to find some solution for the future, because this is not going to be the last pandemic. And I would venture to say that one downside of globalization is that diseases are going to travel more readily. And not just diseases that affect humans, but also diseases that affect animals, that affect agricultural crops. So when we look at sectors to possibly invest in or to bolster, we can add the ag industry, biotech as well, veterinary products, anything health related for human, animal, and plant life for health, among other sectors.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Spain, from Malaga. Do you think that we could live without Asian industries? And perhaps it goes back to some of the statements you made towards driving part of the production capacity much closer home.
No, I think the answer to that is no. Manufacturers are going to invest where labor costs are lower and efficiencies are greater. And that means that Asia will have a comparative advantage in textile trade, in assembly, in many sectors. And eventually when Asian labor costs increase and environmental safeguards become stronger, those industries will move elsewhere. So it's a question of where is it more efficient to invest? My limitation was speaking specifically to health-related aspects. There's going to be a need to make sure that we have adequate supplies of medical goods and supplies, perhaps certain food supplies as well. Judging from what I read in the US papers, toilet paper is also in very short supply, but that's not a large Asian product for the moment. The point I'm trying to make is that in a globalized world, we can't afford to close the doors. There are what, 5.5 billion consumers in Asia? And if we start living without Asian consumers, they're going to start living without European producers. And if you look at countries like Germany or the United States or France, a lot of products are being exported to Asia. And it's not just in the developed world. China is Brazil's largest trading partner too. So we need to realize that between 1.3 billion people or 1.4 billion people in China, 1.2, 1.3 in India, these are important markets. And we would not want to live without them. I think the answer to our colleague in Malaga is that we live in a globalized world. It's not going away, and we should not try to close the door. But we should plan intelligently for the next pandemic, the next problem. We should work together to find the best solution. But compartmentalizing our system, our trade system, is not the solution for the future. And in fact, from my perspective, that's the recipe for economic disaster.
I have another question from Aaron Wu. He said, based on what you've said, I got the impression that your prediction is that we'll see greater liberalization for trading services, or do you think we might see an opposite? For instance, policies akin to ISI?
I believe that we will see greater liberalization for trade and services, either scheduled or unscheduled, the WTO. For instance, if you go to the Cantonal Hospital in Geneva, already we find many doctors and nurses coming from abroad. And we know that many medical professionals have traveled around the world to assist in this problem. And we know that many countries have recruited doctors from abroad. And if you go to the Emirates, for instance, you find many foreign doctors. I don't see this as a problem. I think this is very, very good. And I do believe that part of globalization means liberalization of goods and services. And I believe this is beneficial. I believe we're going to see more economic integration, but it's going to be intelligent integration. Governments are going to need to sit down and work together to decide what is the best way to address the present problem and prevent future problems. Services are part of every good we manufacture, whether it's accounting, lawyer, logistics, transport, you name it, there's always a service component. And that component is increasingly vital. The percentage of the economies in developed countries that is service dependent is it's enormous. And when we add financial services to that equation, we see that services are very important. We're going to see continued liberalization of goods as well. That also is inevitable. But this is, as I said, this is a retrenchment. This is not the end of the world as we know it.
Indeed. Well, there's another participant who asked a couple of questions. How do you see the European Union, in particular the Eurozone, affected after this crisis? How big is the risk of the Eurozone rupture due to the lack of monetary policy independence and difficult interest alignment in times of need? Okay,
I don't pretend to be an EU expert. Let me give that caveat first before I answer. This is a difficult time for the EU. We see democratic values and European values really being challenged for the first time since the EU was formed. And that's very destabilizing. I am worried by this, but I think the EU will survive because this is probably one of the longest periods of peace that we've seen in Europe in history. And it's very important in my mind that the EU survive. So I don't see, I hope there's not going to be a rupture. I don't believe there will be. I think that would be economically disastrous for many European countries. Now, there are problems with the present architecture of the EU. The monetary policy, there's no real strong centrally controlled monetary policy, among other problems. We have some countries that are in the Eurozone, some that are not within the Eurozone. We have countries that are running large deficits. Yeah, there are problems that need to be addressed, but European integration is not going to happen overnight. Integration in the United States did not happen overnight either. The states in the old days, the United States had their own currencies as well. And it was only over time that a national currency developed and evolved and that integration proved successful. And it took a lot of litigation, a lot of court action, which has been the strategy of the ECJ. So I'm cautiously optimistic that Europe will work its way through this. I hope so, because I think that the peace in Europe and the integration of European supply chains, value chains, European production has been very successful and very good for the rest of the world. So I hope that there is a good future for Europe. I, for one, was very disappointed that Brexit happened because I thought Britain brought a lot to the EU. And I think it sets a bad precedent for other countries that are wavering a little bit in the EU or other regions, so to speak.
Okay, thank you. Well, one note to the audience on my side, because we're having around 41 questions that I'm going to try within the limited time we have to select some of them. I see that some of them have a political nature, purely political nature. So unfortunately, in the interest of time, I would mainly focus on those that are directly related to trade and globalization dynamics. So one of them says, it's a pretty long one. You refer to impact on agriculture. How will trade of certain fresh goods that can only be produced in certain geographical areas and not always locally sourced yet are globally critical for a healthy diet and boosting immune system, such as citrus, vitamin C, to be regulated? Spain is currently sourcing 40% of UK citrus. Additionally, the fresh produce industry has faced pressure over the years to reduce plastic and packaging. What will occur with packaging trends and regulation in light of expected increased preference from consumers for wrapped fresh goods as opposed to exposed loose fresh goods?
That's the complex question. I think we're going to find that we're going to be moving towards packaging that's environmentally much friendlier. Already, I'm seeing compost bags that are biodegradable. I think that a lot of the plastic packaging will move towards biodegradable forms as well. I, for one, like going to the market, bringing my bag and bringing back my own products, but that's not going to happen around the world. In terms of trade in fresh goods, that's not going to disappear. There's, in fact, an increasing appetite for fresh fruit, fresh vegetables. But to counterbalance that, there's also an increasing appetite for locally produced goods, fresh goods, farm miles, air miles debate. So I think we're going to see competing trends. Yes, we're going to see off-season produce coming in from Africa, from Latin America. Already we see avocados from Peru, from Pakistan, making it all across Europe. And we're going to see more locally sourced produce, and we're going to see a change in packaging and how people shop. You go to Rwanda, you go to Geneva, to Switzerland, you pay for a plastic bag, and that is discouraged consumption of plastic bags. That's a good thing. So I do believe that we're going to see a revolution in packaging. Single-use packaging, I think, is going to be slowly phased out over time. That's another industry I would not invest in at the moment. But I do think this is important because the environmental issues are critical. The amount of plastic that is turning up in the oceans is a danger for us all. I hope I've made given some sense to a very long question.
Indeed. No, it has many elements to be answered. So we highly thank you for being very efficient in answering the question. I am now looking at a question from someone just here. As Professor Arthur mentioned that many leaders will take advantage or are taking advantage of the situation, how do we take the kind of measures taken by many countries in terms of government intervention for production, export prohibition, and change in the rules of FDI flows? How likely do you think it will attract more disputes? And to what extent do you think it's a violation of WTO law?
Well, I'm not going to speculate on what is and what is not a violation of WTO law, just to say that it's going to be very, very hard to police these kind of measures, as I said earlier. Yes, it's probably a violation of Article 11, and we can argue the Article 20 aspects. Is it necessary for protecting human, animal, or plant life or health? Is it arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination? That would be the analysis. But as I'm not on the appellate body, as the appellate body doesn't really exist anymore, I will not be serving on the appellate body. It's not for me to answer that question. The point is that politicians have a real problem. They need to take some steps. And if a politician says, okay, look, we have 100 ventilators, we're going to sell them abroad, knowing that the virus is going to be coming in 6 months or 3 months or 2 months, they have a political problem. So I understand why the politicians have acted the way they have, but it's unfortunate. And it shows a lack of confidence in the international community. We are starting to see some countries ship ventilators, loan ventilators, hoping ventilators will come back. We're starting to see some elements of international cooperation, which leave me optimistic. But this is not a very good system right now. And in order to remedy the system, we're going to have to plan for the future. The problem is we don't know what the next virus is going to be. Is it going to affect the lungs? Is it going to affect the kidneys? Is it going to affect the heart? We don't know. So we don't really know what supplies are going to be necessary. So it is difficult to plan. Having said that, what it does show is that we need to invest more in our health systems, in our doctors, in our protective equipment, which is obviously going to be a factor in future communicable diseases. That's, again, it's a detour for an answer, but it's the best I can do.
Thanks, Arthur. There's another question on local content requirements. It says, following the current COVID-19 related emergency, we will see a huge rise in local content requirement measures. Should we discuss about making local requirement rules more flexible rather than prohibit many local content requirement measures under international trade and investment law in a violation justification through exception logic just food security, health security, etc., will certainly gain more and more currency. What is your view?
I do not like local content requirements. I think they run fundamentally in opposition to the philosophy of the international trade system. I understand why some politicians think this attractive, but I do not believe that this is good for trade. I do not believe it's good for resolving healthcare problems either. Local content does not mean that the most efficient producer is producing a component, and it's too easily hijacked by politicians that say, okay, we're going to condition this investment on local content. We know this violates 3 and 11 of the WTO, the GATT agreement. We know that it violates the TRIMS agreement. We know that it can violate the subsidies agreement. And I think that we need to go back to what the economists would say, which is find the most efficient producer and let them produce, and use trade to supply the necessary content. Now, I do realize that I, in a way, have dug a little hole for myself by saying that countries are going to want to source locally. And I believe that's true. And when it comes to government procurement, of course, they can do that if they're not members of the government procurement agreement. So there is some room for local procurement, but I'm not a big fan of local content.
There's another question related to e-commerce, which is an issue that has been acknowledged in the question that has been stagnant for a while in WTO conversations. Do you think that the current crisis would help to speed up a more liberal e-commerce regime than ever before as a result of COVID-19?
I hope so. I mean, the debate hasn't been stagnant. Everybody's talking about e-commerce, and I look out the window of our flat in Geneva, and normally I can see the UPS truck, the DHL truck, and the Federal Express truck delivering goods that have been ordered over the internet. E-commerce is here to stay. There are certain issues that are going to have to be resolved. What does it mean for local stores, small stores? What does it mean for tax revenue? How are we going to manage it? But I believe these issues are solvable, and I believe that e-commerce has the potential for many efficiencies. There are many goods that we can order more efficiently, more cheaply over the internet. During a health emergency like right now, the ability to order canvases so my daughter can paint and know they're going to be delivered it's a godsend. It's a wonderful way forward. The other stores are closed. So e-commerce does have a place. Now, I know many countries have been fighting this because they're worried about protecting the local merchants and the local shops. And we see that in Switzerland as well. But I don't think we can close the door on e-commerce, nor should we. It's a real fundamental change in how goods and services are delivered. It is here to stay, and I believe it will grow.
Good. So there's another participant who has delivered 3 questions. He proposes to select one of them. It seems like our participants have been very prolific, for which we thank a lot for your attentiveness to this session. He says the economic consequences of the COVID-19 outbreak will probably catalyze the already ongoing trend of an increase in industrial policies, notably industrial subsidies, and the creation of national champions. What could be the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the ongoing WTO reform discussions?
I'm not sure I accept the premise. I don't necessarily believe that COVID-19 will increase reliance on national champions. We tried this industrial policy in Europe already, and it wasn't that successful. The idea that every European country should have a national airline or a national steel manufacturer or an automotive industry. It's not the way forward. We need to realize that as integration increases, particularly in Europe, there are going to be fewer national champions. There are going to be European-wide producers. The same is true in Latin America and the United States. There are limits, important limits of what the government should do to cultivate certain industries. And I mean, look what's happening in the United States now. where the administration is trying to support the US steel and aluminum manufacturers. It's a policy that doesn't make sense when aluminum can be purchased more cheaply, more efficiently from Canada, or steel more efficiently, more cheaply from Mexico for certain types of steel, certain types of aluminum. Do we need a national champion? What is the purpose? Where we're better off doing is adding value or higher value to goods. So I don't believe that the national champion debate is the right debate. I reject the premise from the very, very beginning. Having said that, I do believe there is a need for concerted government thought in terms of how we plan for the next health crisis. And this means thinking about preparedness, how we manage our healthcare systems, to what extent government needs to be involved in pricing for certain services or pharmaceuticals or procurement of certain products. That's a different debate. But no, I don't believe we're heading back to the era of industrial policy. It wasn't a big success in Latin America. Import substitution wasn't a big success there either. So I don't follow I don't believe in the premise.
So there's another question that was answered by you in terms of is it going to be increased international cooperation as a result of COVID-19? You mentioned that governments should sit and discuss and plan for the future. So it's partly there. There's another question saying, apart from local content requirement as protectionist measures, what other measures are more likely to come as protectionist in your view?
Say that again, the last part of the question.
Yes. What other measures, apart from local content requirements, are more likely to come as protectionist in your view? Which type of protectionist type of measures we may see surge from now onwards?
Certainly the export restrictions that we've seen on certain medical products are, if there are domestic producers, that's going to be protectionist. Limiting the export of components of ventilators, these are certainly protectionist. If we try to say, well, every WTO member needs to manufacture its own ventilators or its own personal protective equipment, that would be protectionist as well. I think that there's a lot of potential for mischief here, and we need to be very, very careful. Governments need to find efficient producers and secure supply chains. Perhaps it can be done by contract, perhaps it can be done by fiat, but they need to avoid protection, because if we head down the protectionist road, the trade system falls apart and development prospects disintegrate, prosperity falls apart. Trade has been extremely important as a catalyst for economic development, and the tax revenue that generates goes into healthcare, goes into hospitals, goes into purchasing protective equipment, goes into government-run healthcare facilities for countries that manage healthcare that way. So we need to realize that the trade system is fragile. It needs respect. It should not be undermined by local content requirements, by onerous export prohibitions. We need to realize that an export prohibition in one country may come around boomerang against another country. Having said that, the way forward, because it's better to have a solution, is through cooperation. This is an epidemic that has hit different countries at different times. Ventilators can be shipped to other countries when the epidemic is strong. Protective equipment can be manufactured for one country, and when that country has what it needs and the virus strikes another country, production can be shifted to fit another market. We need to think about it logically and plan. We need to realize that the politicians are being very reactive and not necessarily thinking about the importance of the trade system or what's necessarily right a year or 2 years from now.
Great. Well, in the interest of time, knowing that we are getting close to 6 p.m., which was our initial target, I will try to skim through of the questions because there are many still. There's one that was related to trade remedies and whether we should expect trade remedies to increase from now onwards. And also there was another question on whether the WTO should play an active role in promoting a tool of coordination of medical goods and devices among WTO members in order to avoid the fragmentation of unilateralism, as we've seen as the pandemics unfolded.
Yeah, anti-dumping cases are increasing dramatically. Our Washington office is overwhelmed with them. A lot of the work is being handled virtually, though, because nobody can travel. So the answer to that question is yes, it's definitely going to happen. What was the second part of the question?
The other part of the question was whether the WTO could act as a coordinating authority in terms of medical goods and devices among WTO members, considering that there has been some restrictions.
The WTO could do it, the WHO could do it, governments could do it bilaterally or regionally or multilaterally as well. It's less important. I mean, it doesn't seem like the normal role for the WTO. That would be a role where I would imagine the WHO would have more expertise, though it doesn't have necessarily the enforcement infrastructure of the WTO. It might bring more expertise. But my guess is that this is probably an issue that's going to be handled regionally or bilaterally. I don't see everybody running to the WHO or the WTO to solve this problem. But of the organizations, I think we can, despite the criticism that WHO has received, I do believe its role internationally and globally is going to become more important.
Good. So I think there are two questions from Pietro. Let's try to, I mean, we only have 3 questions left. So perhaps
3 minutes left or 45 questions?
Well, there's roughly 1 minute left. So yes, let me know how would you like to address them. Perhaps I can take you a last wrap-up question to close this session. I leave it up to you.
I'm happy to take the questions.
Good. How do you foresee developments of FDI going forward?
Of foreign direct investment?
Yes. Do you foresee an increase in interregional?
Yeah, I mean, once we get through this pandemic, I think members are going to realize that FDI is critical, local investment and FDI. The potential of FDI as a means to transfer technology, resources, and to spur development is very, very clear. And I believe it's going to grow, and I believe that's a good thing.
And perhaps we can take this as a final question from the audience. What is your view on the effect of COVID-19 on economic integration in the MENA region?
That's a good question, and I don't have a good answer for it because I don't know. I mean, we know that the MENA region is doing a lot in healthcare, and we know that it's a destination now for healthcare tourism, but a lot of that travel has stopped. But to some extent, I see it as a possible catalyst, but I don't think I know enough about how healthcare is managed in the MENA region to give the best answer to it. It's hard for a lawyer to say I don't know the answer to a question, but in that case, I don't have a good answer, and I would pass.
Good. Well, perhaps there was a latest question, and I think it's interesting enough for us to perhaps take it. You can answer very rapidly, and this way we can just wrap up. It's, because I'm seeing Maria is showing up now in her camera. Do you think that the crisis from COVID would change the rules of capitalism as we know them? Are we facing the biggest global crisis in the last century?
I think the answer to that is yes. I think we're going to realize, and I have an article that I've just finished on this that I'm trying to get published now, just a 2-pager, that we're going to realize that there's a role for government, that the free market and laissez-faire capitalism can't solve all healthcare problems. We're seeing this in the allocation of resources. We're seeing this in research and development. We're seeing this in drug testing. We're seeing this in the testing of equipment for antibody testing and COVID-19 testing. Yes, there is a role for government. And the question, in my mind, is a different question. The question is what's best done at the international level, what's best done at the regional or EU level, what's best done at the national level, what's best left to the private sector or done at the local level. And we need to sit down and actually map out the answer to that question and realize that this is something that can evolve and change over time. But what we're seeing now is that there are certain things that should be handled at the international level, where the WHO or the WTO or other organizations can be involved at the EU level, at the national level. But when it comes to producing the medical devices, the testing equipment, the protective gear, this is going to be largely done in the private sector. And we need to find the best way to bring the business community in. I think they're there already in many instances, and recognize that their role is also very, very important. So yes, it is going to change how we look at healthcare in general, but in any instance of market failure, there's going to be a role for government, whether it's environmental pollution or plastics on the high sea or healthcare or any of a number of issues we've talked about. There is going to be a role for government, but it can't be a role that suffocates the private sector. We've got to find the right balance. It's all about balance in the end, isn't it?
Indeed, indeed. Thank you so much, Arthur Appleton, for this latest reflection. And also for giving us a roadmap, at least a mental roadmap and food for thought during this crisis in terms of how trade may behave in its various areas. So thank you so much for agreeing to tackle our questions today. And well, let's keep in touch as part of your involvement in IE School of Global and Public Affairs. Thank you.
And my thanks to IE for making this platform available, and to Maria and Altagracia for allowing it to happen. I hope that the conversation has been good for everyone, and I look forward to receiving some comments by email. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you both for the conversation. I think it was a really interesting conversation addressing some of the most important questions we all have in our minds at the moment. Thank you to the audience for the active chat. That was really useful. Well, you've seen, we've shared the link of the website where you're going to have the recording of this session and other sessions we've had and we're going to have, and that are going to happen within the Leading Complex Times dialogues. There was a fantastic dialogue. Again, Arthur and Altagracia, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And well, let's keep in touch. Okay, have a great evening.
Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye. Bye.